Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about the minimum build investment in party builders. So these are games where you're building out a set or a team of characters. I would even expand it to include games you play co-op and you have friends with a variety of builds and you can support each other in some way. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's an interesting topic because these are games where you often play each piece on its own. Certainly, if you're playing a multiplayer game, your friends play their build on their own. You're playing a game with multiple people in your party. You will often play each of them kind of on their own, but there's also the team as a whole. So if you have limited resources, you might invest in everybody evenly, and there are a lot of games that kind of pressure you to do that. But a good amount of the time, the game will let you at least somewhat not do that. You'll underinvest in some kinds of characters. And this creates a very odd dynamic where you're kind of building some much less complete characters at once. I've always found this a very cool aspect of making builds. It's kind of a fundamental thing that's fun about making builds, that you can reassign resources to different parts of the game, not just that you can make a part of the game however you want, but you can say, I would like it if this game was more about X, Y, or Z, so I'm going to put more of my build resources here instead. For our example, to get us started, we'll start with a game where that's, like a fairly big, well, a pretty interesting situation aspect for that. EyePatchNotes begins. ChronoArk mildly honors the Holy Trinity across its roster, tank, healer, damage dealer. While some investigators, the characters in your ChronoArk team, you get 4, occupy 2 legs of this time-tested triangle. They might be a healer and a damage dealer. What the player must do is readily apparent. Quickly defeat enemies and rebound from damage taken. Merely tanking and stalling is pressured in this game by the Black Fog counter. This is constant damage and video and audio cues hurrying the player along, basically like an enraged timer, or the fight is a limited amount of turns before it starts getting bad. Power disparity. Enemies, and particularly bosses, will outpace most healers. Right, you could think of it as a race. Most enemies in this game are not very fun to spend a long time with. You want to kill them quickly. And then finally, few incentives. The player has few reasons to prolong fights. Because damage that you take that doesn't get hit with follow-up damage, if you get a big hit and you don't get hit again, you heal that at the end of a fight in ChronoArk. You're really rewarded for getting only some light scratches that you can recover from quickly. If you take more serious follow-up damage, that's much harder to heal. So stalling a fight to heal would make your healing much less efficient in most cases. So that's not good. And there aren't a lot of abilities, the other kind of incentive for prolonging a fight, there aren't a lot of abilities that kind of build up in power over time without a limit that you can reach without prolonging a fight. There actually are a lot of abilities like that, but they don't take very long to reach their full potential. So there's just no benefit to stalling and then exploding the enemy most of the time. Even honing in on tank characters themselves in this game, most of their tanking abilities progress the game state. Leon and Miss Chain have dedicated counterattack moves, or parry and burn, respectively. Narhan brings ample stuns and crit support. Right, he's actually fairly offensive. The stars of this parlay, however, are Ironheart and Momori, the other 2 healers, I believe. In one corner, a preemptive shielder with pocket debuffs and all-in attacks. In the other, a reactive... Actually, what the hell is Momori? Indeed, we'll try to explore it a little in this parlay. Before we take a deep dive into the Twisted Land, a few more fences to guide discussion. While the player is not forced to invest into any particular character, there are 3 trends that nudge the player into leveling everyone equally. Most passives turn on at level 2, so leveling them once. Maximum mana expansion for your whole team is gated before every character is level 3, so you kind of have to level them twice. And characters have a 5-card minimum in their deck. Therefore, even if they're not leveled, it's not like that makes your overall deck size smaller yet. You might as well upgrade those cards because they have to have at least 5. In ChronoArk, you can readily remove cards from your deck if you go above the minimum. In most games, that's made very hard to do. In ChronoArk, it's made very easy, and then the trade-off is you simply can't have less than 5 cards in your deck. Different approach from a lot of deck builders. A character who's not given any level ups or skill books contributes only basic skills to the party. Contrast with a character who's level 3 and given the bare minimum to avoid slowing down the party. Keep this level 3 benchmark in mind as we gather round the campfire. From a purely mathematical perspective, Ironheart's passive converts excess healing into same turn barrier, so like a shield over your health, at 66% efficiency. That is to say, the player can choose to lose 1/3 of a healing skill in an attempt to tank a hit. Ironheart asks the player to preempt and predict incoming damage because the shield doesn't last through the turns, or use those barriers to cash out and deal big damage. He's got a shield bash that will deal damage based on your total barrier, so you can just use a bunch of heals on one turn to get a bunch of barrier, and then do your shield bash skill for big damage. A player can dump the party's barrier for an all-in attack strategy, depleting resources in hand and the future to ideally close out the fight, right? It's very bad if you don't then win from doing that because you dumped all your resources out. This commitment is why the Parley author prefers Momori, an unassuming, self-damaging tank. Like Ironheart, simply having Momori in the party will increase survivability. Where Ironheart requires input, healing skills, to give barrier, Momori will store 40% of incoming attacks as damage for her future self. A player can trust Momori to do her job, even without investment or dire planning. In an extreme example, Momori can store several lives worth of inner desire and drag them to the floor if she dies. Proof positive that she's contributing to the party. What an ending point. So we've got a lot to work with. Geez, EyePatchNotes, you didn't have to put it like that. That's rough. Cool. So Chrono Arc is a useful example here because it's a game where there are some roles that are less centered in the party. Tanking is something that Chrono Arc's design resists significantly. As we talked about at the beginning, there are various factors in combat that mean on the surface, tanking is basically just bad, and the main benefit of tanking, I would argue, is more controlling the risk of incoming hits in this game, not actually like enduring a lot of attacks. That's basically always bad in Chrono Arc, I would say. And so, as you said, many of the tanks either move the game state forward or kind of allow you to pseudo-absorb a hit. You know, they let you attempt to just preempt and then not take damage. Cool. And so what's then interesting is that Chrono Arc is also a game where you have a kind of minimum amount you can invest in each character. You more or less have to get everyone to level 3. I would say it's almost inconceivable that you play Chrono Arc and you would make a team where it would make sense not to level every character to level 3 by like the later parts of the run. So this is a game, just as an example, and there'll be a lot of others we can apply this to, where there is a role you'd like to underinvest in, probably, your tank. And indeed, some of these abilities are kind of good. If you don't invest further in the character, they're not bad passives to have. But you kind of have to invest a little bit, and then maybe you'll invest more. Basically, what you're implying about Chrono Arc specifically is that you feel like Ironheart's passive does this less well than Momori's. And I do think that the balancing situation here is pretty interesting. As you talked about earlier, the other tanks are kind of designed in a way where they move the fight forward in exchange for tanking being kind of a bad idea in this game. In particular, there's some design space of redirecting attacks or protecting healing gauge. So Leon has some stuff where she'll kind of intercept an attack that was coming at a unit and miss Chain's burn passive with a bunch of extra use. I think that's what it's called, right? That's what that does. Protects your healing gauge. So if you get hit and then you would get hit by a follow-up hit, you don't become harder to heal. As I mentioned earlier in the parlay, generally follow-up hits, you lose your kind of easy recovery. Miss Chain prevents this. So she kind of doesn't tank exactly, but in practice, it means it's less bad to get hit a few follow-up times. So again, it's weird. They're more of like a, if you were rushing down the opponent, trying to kill them quickly, these are units that deflect the errant blows that would get in your way along the way to rushing down your target. Kind of not what tanking normally is in a lot of games. And then Narhan is more, I would say, more of a preventative measure. The crit support, he'll just make you do more damage. That's just straight up, that's just damage buffing. but then stuns, and Narhan has some like max HP increasing stuff. He's trying to prevent the damage in the first place, you could say. Ironheart and Momori then are interesting as the characters in this game that are actually trying to tank damage, like genuinely trying to tank damage. Mistchain just makes it less bad to have taken the damage. Leon and Narhan, to a lesser extent, pretty much just prevent or redirect the damage. And so these are the characters that are competing for, I would argue anyway, actually tanking damage. And that is the thing that is so bad in Chrono Arc. The other tanks kind of, they're tanking, but they're kind of avoiding the issue. These are the characters then that are kind of the worst on paper for a game with this formula. And the game tries to get around that a little bit by giving them pretty strong passives that you can invest very minimally in. And then, you know, there you go. They have a leg to stand on. I think it will be interesting to discuss balancing knobs for this type of design, because what I want to look at is this idea that games provide different incentives to invest different amounts in characters within the same possibly maligned role. This is a framing device. I think one example in most games is healers. It's pretty common in my experience that a unit that is healing your party in a variety of games can afford to be worse at that, or the game won't reward too much of that. Or you get a benefit from having some ability to heal versus a lot. An example I like to give is that even just like lifesteal abilities in games, often having the very small amount of lifesteal is outsized beneficial compared to having a lot. Like you get a benefit that is kind of not proportional to the amount of lifesteal you have. Just the idea that you can keep attacking and you will eventually top yourself off. As long as it's not a ridiculously small amount of lifesteal, it's often very effective even if you have a really small amount of it. You can see in a lot of games. And the same thing with healing. As long as you've made damage, you've made damage not perfect. Let's just leave it like that. And that benefit is often larger than the benefit of healing faster in a lot of games. I think that's sort of what it is. Furthermore, if you make damage non-permanent, and then you invest the resources you would have invested to make your healer heal faster in doing damage faster, well, dead enemies do no damage. And so as the adage goes, it often ends up being the case that if the healers are balanced, this isn't a bad thing necessarily, but you will end up benefiting less, or like it will be unclear what the benefit of investing in healers more is. You can kind of do it and succeed, but the player will probably realize, well, okay, but I could just get damage, and they are kind of balanced. But if I take the damage, I just win faster. And so I'll generally choose to do that. I can think of many surprisingly diverse types of games where this remains true. And even a lot of the good healers in Chrono Arc are pretty proactive as well. You know, they have significant offense buffs or significant enemy debuffs or damage debuffs and stuff. Or they get their healing by doing damage, something like that. So yeah, it's I think that situation carries over in this game to tanks. But the point is that in a lot of games where you can spread your resources like this, not only is it kind of fun to underinvest in some parts of the game and overinvest in other parts of the game, harnessing that core buildcraft thing where you're kind of emphasizing the parts of the game you like more. In a lot of games, there is a type of thing that you would, at base, all things being equal, want to invest less in, and things you'd want to invest more in. And that's not really avoidable or bad, in my opinion. That's fine. It might be a bummer if there was kind of never a reason to invest more in tanks or healers, but that's by the by. I don't think that's true in most games. Anyway, so I think it's interesting to look for a moment at how to balance this kind of thing out. On one level, giving a character a passive that gives you this much benefit, I mean, let's just look at the Momori passive again. If you level her to 2, and we've established that you pretty much will level her to 3 in this game, you just get this effect. You just have this benefit. When any ally takes physical damage, reduce final damage by 40%. Just all the time, forever now. And she can just sit there on your team as kind of a totem of support. Indeed, for a character that we assume you're going to invest to level 3 and no more, That's a pretty good starting point. I mean, she doesn't need to gain much from that. You can get some that Momori, I know off the top of my head, has some skills that use the inner desire stored damage as well. So they'll have mechanics like Momori has used this passive to tank a bunch of damage, represented by something in your hand. And then she'll have skills that give you like a big damage hit on an enemy based on the damage that she's absorbed or something like that. There are some payoffs for her having tanked a bunch of damage where she can kind of use that to her advantage, even while suffering the consequences. And if you level her only a few times, you could very easily just pick those and very little else. So her deck is essentially just that stuff and maybe a basic skill or two, and that's it. And you can put some weird utility skills. Previous EyePatchNotes Parlay was about Chrono Arc has these general basic skills that basically anybody can get that often will counter a specific type of enemy or like get you out of a specific situation or status effect. And I think they're really interesting. I think the reason I slept on them was because it can be awkward to fit them into a character without consequence. But here's the perfect candidate, a character that isn't really going to get a lot of skills naturally on their own. You kind of wouldn't even want them that much even if you did get them. You want to channel your level ups toward other characters, but you get a lot of benefit for the first few levels that you kind of have to do anyway. Those characters then, Momori and Ironheart, would be very good fits for like a random utility skill. You know, you can just kind of put it there. And indeed, I don't think that's uncommon across games like this in general, where a character you underinvest in can sometimes be an interesting kind of like a carrier or holding spot for a piece of utility that you were just kind of looking for somewhere else. I'm going to get into other examples because I think it's helpful to illustrate the point more broadly. So one example is in Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter Wilds allows you to bring 2 weapons to a hunt, but you can only use one at once, and weapon swapping is not very fast compared to what you're imagining in other games. You have to get back on your mount and circle the monster a bit and pull your other weapon out of the mount's saddlebag. You could say maybe this is a little bit realistic, where you can't have carried that giant weapon on your person, and so you need to get it out of the storage that is carting you around all these monsters. You can't switch that quickly. You can still switch fairly quickly. You don't have to stop fighting as per se, but it takes like a good maybe 10-15 seconds, a meaningful amount of time. You're not going to weave combos together between 2 weapons most of the time. Therefore, what utility can you get out of your secondary weapon? Well, there's a few things, and that's not what this parlay is about, but the point is, one of the most common ones is the hunting horn. This is basically a hammer, but when you do a skill, I got ahead of myself, you play a note. The attack, the swing of the hunting horn, is also represented as a note on a score at the top of your screen. And if you do some basic little combos, like 3 or 4 certain attacks in a row, Y, B, Y, B, Y, B, then that will be, you hit the button to play a song, and that will give your team like a defensive buff or something. Or your team is immune to the monster's roars for the next few minutes. You get some kind of buff, a healing or offense buff. They have all sorts of stuff. And different hunting horns have different abilities and buffs on them. But a lot of the better ones, it's going to be that thing that prevents monster roars and the defensive stuff. And there's a pretty good offensive one that's actually kind of only on 1. So that probably won't overlap. But some of the better buffs, right, you can imagine if everybody brought a hunting horn as their secondary, well, you're going to overlap. This could be good. You could just switch off who does it. Someone needs to take a break from the fight for a few seconds anyway. They got hurt or whatever, and they're fleeing. And while they're fleeing, they're running around on their mount for a sec to take a breather and heal up on there while a little bit safer and more mobile. Maybe they take the liberty of grabbing their hunting horn and re-upping everybody's buffs. But a lot of the time, because there are some other weapons that are useful in your secondary slot, you and your friends in your squad of 3, well, you'll want to designate someone who just does the hunting horn stuff. Whose loadout, then, has the space? Who's using a weapon that just doesn't really want anything else to swap in? And therefore, maybe they have the most space. They lose the least for hunting horn. The problem here is that the opportunity cost of that second weapon slot is pretty low in Monster Hunter. There are plenty of ways people play, I think plenty of kinds of players, where they use the second weapon slot, but it does very little in terms of the power of their loadout. And indeed, even if you try as hard as you can, which I do, to fill that slot with utility, there's not that much. You're going to end up repeating some functions. If you play Monster Hunter Wilds, I reckon it's the bowguns and like a greatsword with critical draw to wake up attack monsters or do a bunch of damage when you need to stay evasive. And then the other one is like another copy of the weapon you are using to not sharpen it, which can be faster sometimes, or to adapt to different status effect buildup. The monster's already been paralyzed 3 times, and so it's harder each time in this game. Maybe you switch to a different status effect, but it's just the weapon you were using before, something like that. There are some corner case ones, like 2 hunting horns using Melody Extender, but again, that's not what this is about. We're not going to get into it. The point is, for a lot of players, that doesn't have that much opportunity cost. So you can see that that is a way that you can balance it out. Maybe players aren't as interested, or the buffs from the hunting horn aren't as good, but the cost of including the hunting horn in your loadout is also not very high. And so this is a way that you can potentially get players to sign up for the party. Now, I think it's often a little bit better to take the opposite approach. I think there's a divide in game design thought. That makes sense. Make the barrier to entry low, but the reward just isn't that large. And you could argue that's kind of what Chrono Arc is doing. Your tank doesn't have a lot to gain by being leveled up, but also you aren't going to spend very many resources on them anyway. So maybe the player gets thinking, tries to get creative about what to use that limited space for, or just levels them up more, looking for more options. Not a bad or invalid approach. I don't think, clearly, it's not, both very popular games. But I do personally think it's interesting to take the opposite approach, which is to put a lot of pressure on the player's decision. Remnant 2 is the example that comes to mind. This is a game where you and your party members have the option to build into some offensive debuffs against the enemy. This reminds me a lot of just Rusty's parlay about auras. People are not that good at evaluating these effects, which means in most games they are just unacceptably overpowered. Like, so blatantly the best thing in the entire game if you can sign people up for the party. So in Remnant 2, I would say the big ones are the exposed debuff, which there's a couple of sources, but for example, one of them is you just put an item on your build that says if the enemy gets 4 different status effects, they get exposed and they take like 20% more damage from everything, essentially, your whole team. So that's really strong. 20% more damage from that slot in your build in Remnant 2 would have been good in the first place. Giving it to everybody is insane. By far the most valuable thing you could give to a group in most cases. And there's also stuff like the Ranger class, one of the starting classes, has a skill where you'll mark enemies. Marked enemies take more crits. It's easier to do crits to them. So because these don't stack, it's kind of like whose loadout loses the least by adding them in. And of course, these are both multiplayer games, my Monster Hunter Wilds and Remnant 2 examples. These are games where part of the pressure is, it might just be that some players in the multiplayer session simply do not want to adapt their build in this way, and so that might be how you pick. But if you have friends that sign up to the build crafting party, I think the question gets more interesting in a way. Whose thing that they like loses less by adding this stuff in? We've had a really good time making these 3-person or 4-person cells in these games, where oftentimes what happens, for my play group anyway, is I'll have come up with some build that is quite restrictive. Then we'll come up with another piece of utility that's less restrictive. You can kind of just slap it on a loadout. And then there'll be a third person where not only do we not have any utility left for them to carry, it's also good to have someone that just doesn't synergize as much with their fellows. And I think that's an interesting dynamic with the idea of underinvesting in a tank as well. You have a situation in game design where it's beneficial to have some characters not interact as heavily with others, that just kind of work. And so not as much needs to line up for things to go well. And yet you don't have to throw synergy out the window. There's some room to just combo. For examples like the damage buffs that I was talking about in those other games, it's often that, well, what you're doing is increasing the party's damage. So if you sacrifice too much of your damage, or if the other party members sacrifice too much of their damage, it's actually then not good to invest in damage that way. You have to be giving them buffs while losing little enough damage that you actually are increasing the team's damage output. Generally, this is kind of hard if the abilities are quality of life buffs, but not that hard as long as you are giving damage buffs to your whole team, because you're giving damage buffs to yourself as well. That as long as you use, as long as you don't have to take too much time out of the fight to give, it ends up working out that it is still good damage. And usually that's what balances it out, is you have to drop your damage to give out the damage buffs. And then if everybody does their stuff, then you're going to do more damage, but it's got to work out. I think that's good. It's fun to have that push and pull between investing a lot and getting some synergy with some characters, and then also not investing a lot and having things that just work for other characters. In Chrono Arc, since you have 4 party members and they're all controlled by one person, well, their decks are all shuffled together, it often makes sense to me to have 2 characters that have a pretty tightly knit synergy, and then 2 characters that are just kind of doing their own thing and give you value. And would you look at that, the default game mode for the game is that you start the run by picking 2 characters, any 2, your tightly woven synergy perhaps, and then recruiting a 3rd, and then a little later in the run, your 4th. And those could be standalone value pieces. Look at that. It's almost like they knew that when they designed this game. I think this is one of Chrono Arc's strengths. They really know what their game's design space is, I think. That I said in my video praising this as one of my build systems of the year last year, that I think the thing about Chrono Arc is that it's not amazing at basically anything else except its build system. And at the time of this recording, that is so uncommon that it causes us to discuss things in a kind of different way. Like, very few games know their design space well, I think. It's really interesting to see. Even the examples I give, like Remnant 2, I think is above average in the industry at understanding its design space. Monster Hunter, I don't think is. Monster Hunter Wilds, it's like the build options available are an interesting, that's the word I would use here, was be nice, an interesting assortment of the design space you could have, chosen seemingly largely at random. Like, why these damage boosting abilities? Why these defensive abilities, like, in this way? The answer for many of them seems to be because Monster Hunter has been that way for a while and we're just carrying it over. There are some very bespoke limitations on your build in Monster Hunter, but that can be interesting in its own way. A topic for another time, but the chance to invest like more offense or more defense skills is very much alive in that game as well. I think that's one of the highlights. So it's great, but indeed there's a lot of potential effects that would be interesting trade-offs that just aren't in the game that I think would be pretty obvious, and a lot of redundant offensive skills that often will not be interesting decisions that are piled into the game for reasons I don't entirely understand. Like, that seems bad almost 100% of the time. But who knows? No one knows all builds. The point is having that flexibility to invest more offense, more defense, but then also more or less synergy in different parts of your loadout is interesting. I originally brought this up as a way to segue into talking about some of the available ways to balance this stuff out. So let's do that a little more now. I just wanted to illustrate what I meant. So besides like the synergy hooks thing, less or more pieces that could be good if you synergize them with other parts of your loadout, or like broad or specific synergy pieces. Chrono Arc is a pretty good example here. There's some units that do a thing that is useful to a lot of other units. You'd get more value if you did this with a lot of other members of the cast, but just not that much, versus some units that enable like discarding, for example, which not very many units benefit from, but the units that benefit from it benefit a lot from it. And so this unit maybe has less synergy hooks, but that's not always bad. And the ones they do have are more rare, bringing me to exclusive claims to fame, is what I'd call them. Things that not very many or no other effects in the game do. How many of these does a character have? Maybe they're less powerful overall, but they have a lot of exclusive claims to fame, exclusive build hooks, basically. If you want something done, they're the one who has it, but they're not particularly good at any one of those things. Or sometimes you get a version of the design where they actually are really good at all of the things, but you can't do them very much. So an example in Chrono Arc would be Joey, in my mind. He's pretty good at healing, and he's pretty good at doing damage over time, and he's pretty good at landing a stun on demand. He doesn't really have a weak version of each of those things, I wouldn't say, but he just isn't going to be able to do very much of each one in many teams' cases. You know, he'll have strong healing regeneration skills, like there's that one skill he has that you only get once per fight. Or he's got the stun, but in Chrono Arc, enemies get stun resistance if you stun them multiple times. So even though you could easily get copies of that stun ability, and it's got a very high chance to succeed, you're probably not going to get it off more than, once. So you are going to get good effects, but they're unfocused, which in Chrono Arc, it's often valuable for them to be focused. So you sometimes get that form of design as well. I put win conditions in my list. This is a little bit weird because what it means differs from game to game, but win conditions I think can be most usefully thought of as when you get an opening or when you have set up, what is the kind of payoff, or like how do you cash in that success? You're playing a more controlling strategy. When you stabilize or when you build up a lot of barrier with Ironheart, what is the release valve that gives you value out of that? In a Magic the Gathering deck, a win condition could be you get an aggressive start, so your opponent is on the back foot, and then what is the big creature at the top of your mana curve, an aggro deck maybe at 4 mana often, that is going to finish out your opponent. Because they're already behind, you play something that's a little too hard to deal with quickly, and they end up dying because you have too much tempo advantage. Or, again, in something like Monster Hunter Wilds or Remnant 2, win conditions. I mean, they're live action games, so it's like, what is that? In Monster Hunter, it's often your big damage combo that is pretty vulnerable and takes a lot of time to perform. This is your kind of release valve. You manage to tank through the monster's attacks, not die, and do some damage. The monster eventually goes down for a sec. What do you do to take advantage of this situation? There are plenty of weapons in Monster Hunter. You could do a whole thing about this exact topic in Monster Hunter. That's just how much does the weapon get safety while it's not popping off versus how good is the damage when it gets to pop off? That kind of thing. How big is the reward when you get an opening? Looking at you, Gunlance. Anyway, that's by the by. In even just like Remnant 2 or Warframe, these shooting games, it can often be that you have some ability off cooldown, or once you set up your debuffs, or once you wind up your weapon's mods or whatever. In Remnant 2, you've charged up the weapon's mod attacks, and then you unleash all your stuff. Once your character is kind of charged up, what do you do in exchange? You end the fight in some bombastic way. And some loadouts might not be designed to have these things, but win conditions like that, less or more common, and also less or more common to that type of character. So in the Chrono Arc example, you can balance characters like Ironheart and Momori by letting them have win conditions. I think that's one of the ways they are balanced out. If you consider Ironheart and Momori to be the weakest tanks because they try to actually tank, which is the worst idea in Chrono Arc, whereas Leon, Mistchain, and Narhan are more proactive. One of the ways I think that Chrono Arc balances out Ironheart and Momori, pretty unarguably good characters, I would say, in the context of the game, is that they have some win condition like abilities, which is not very common or not very readily available from other tanks. Ironheart has that shield bash who convert all your barrier, which he gives you another way to get, into a bunch of damage. Momori has those skills where if she's absorbed a lot of damage for your party, you do a big hit of damage. This is not something this category of character has much of. So even though they're weaker in some ways, giving them the win conditions in other ways, well, is very nice. I think the role itself, going a little further, these are meant to chain together. It's a nice little segue. Huh? Yeah, okay. Is a way that these things are often balanced. Tanks can have more broken individual abilities, and they really do in Chrono Arc, I think, because they have the drawback of being tank units. They don't do amazing damage, well, except with these abilities, and they often don't heal or heal very much, and so they can have quite strong effects if they don't do those two key things, because Chrono Arc so privileges that stuff. This is a good design idea, I think, in general. If an effect isn't one of the main things the player wants, it often needs to be very powerful to feel good at all, because it's not directly relevant to the gameplay loop. So often to use it, you have to do things that are not moving the game state forward. Therefore, when you do this action, it's got to move the game state forward a lot to make up for that. And again, the synergy versus not so much kind of thing. I think we kind of have our answer then. Investing only a little in these characters can be interesting because a lot of the ways that you can balance out a worse character fit well with a character that isn't that invested. So let's look at the situation again. Your Chrono Arc team going into the boss fight, or that final harder stage with those challenge fights, you might have a smattering of level 5 and level 6 characters with lots of carefully handpicked skills in their little 5-card decks getting shuffled together. But then your tank might be still only level 3 with their passive and only a couple of skills, maybe a utility skill you squirreled away on them. So are they like any good? Well, I think one of the nice things here is that they are if you optimize for those strengths. Well, you didn't invest a lot in them, and they're tanks, and tanking isn't that good of an idea. But if the few skills that you get on them are things like win conditions, like some kind of explosive release valve, you get an opening in the fight with Ironheart, you spend all your healing on shield, and then you brought his shield bash skill, so you get in there and get a big pop of damage. You spent almost 0 resources on having that in there. You don't have the drawback of your whole deck is built around this. It's not. It's just when it comes up, you have the ability to do a big burst of damage. It can be very nice. You get the benefit of something that doesn't take up a lot of space. It's not a lot of risk if your synergy gets interrupted because you didn't really build into that, but it's there. It's available if you need it. Again, same thing with Momori and her big built-up damage attacks. So that's one thing. You can take advantage of the kind of limited space and get a synergy a little bit, but also it just kind of does good damage. And then there are a lot of skills among these characters. Like one of the things I think helps Ironheart out a little bit, I don't know Momori's kit as well, but Ironheart has a good number of skills that are only used once per battle and they're removed from the deck. This is usually framed as a drawback. It's a powerful ability, so you only get to use it once per fight. But for Ironheart, I mean, I would like it if I could run Ironheart with no skills in his deck. And this lets you do that. You can use these skills, and then they're just removed. And then, by turn 3 or 4, Ironheart has almost no cards in your deck, and so he's kind of out of the way. That's much more achievable and much more good for a character that just isn't doing as much damage. Thus, it becomes quite powerful to have a passive like Ironheart's if you can kind of not have his deck. Let's just imagine that it's true, I don't know if it is, that Momori has a lot less of those skills than Ironheart does, a lot less skills, that when you use them, they're eliminated from your deck. I'm not sure that's true, but it might be. It feels like it is. Ironheart has a lot of them. And so let's just imagine that that's true. That would balance out Momori's kind of unarguably better passive for mitigating damage by buffing Ironheart through allowing him to basically remove his cards from your deck more often, meaning that his underwhelming passive can be had while he interrupts the rest of your game even less than is normally possible, making it justifiable that that passive is a little bit less strong. And then again, if you have your one Ironheart card in your whole deck is his shield bash thing, when it comes up, you gained a lot of flexibility or a nice out, like a secondary win condition, to burst damage and the fight from very, very little space. You lost almost nothing and spent almost no resources, that you didn't need to spend anyway, getting him to this nice state where you've got the passive, you've got the shield bash thing or some defensive ability, and then that's kind of it. You got some big defensive burst abilities early on in the fight to set you up, but then he's out of the way. Like, I think that can be very good. Likewise, Momori might create a somewhat more sustainable gameplay loop. You have a character that, okay, yeah, but what if the fight does go long? You'd want your abilities to not go away. I'm sure the Ironheart ability would be nice if it didn't remove itself from your deck right away. There just are benefits to it removing itself from your deck, and so Momori balances that out, maybe. Pretty cool. I really, really like the expendable ability design in a lot of games, and this is something I think would be cool to see in more games. Some ability that has like a short cooldown, maybe, but you get 2 charges, but they don't cool down anymore after the second use or something. So you play Remnant 2 and you're in a firefight, and you have some burst ability that cools down very quickly, and you can use it twice, but then once you've used it, you just don't get it anymore. The game doesn't have anything like this. It would be kind of a weird design because a lot of Remnant 2 engagements are very short, but some of them are of a medium length, and so it could be interesting for a theoretical game. It's fun because it allows you to think about the sort of overall pace of a fight. I think it invites players to think, well, how long am I going to be fighting for? I mean, how many turns am I targeting, basically. This is also a really common piece of advice in Magic the Gathering, to advise players to think about, you have this really expensive top end card, but does your deck want there to be a turn 8 where this could be cast? Or are situations where you would get to the point where you can cast this bad enough for your deck that you should probably just accept that the game is going badly at that point? It's is often correct, I think. It's good to not bother having a card at every mana cost and instead embrace where your deck kind of wants to be, and then hedge your bets on, if a later turn comes, you can always play a combination of medium costed cards or something instead of having a slot in your deck that is literally completely useless unless a turn that you don't want to comes, and then it's like, fine, you're probably still screwed. So I think that's a good way to frame it. The idea then being that you have a lot of different ways to balance out tanks, I think feels pretty good in Chrono Arc. I think that sounds good. I have a higher opinion of this than I thought I would toward the end of this parlay. Basically, I just think it's interesting to have different amounts of space the player can use to invest, and how that can be balanced out, how you can use that to get either a lot of build fulfillment out of moving resources to the part of the game you like more, or get unique advantages where maybe you didn't want to stop for this utility ability, but if you have the space open, then that can be kind of cool. And I also think this is where we can come back to the idea that it's the sort of minimum build investment in party builders. Investing a little bit in this character that maybe the player wasn't entirely excited to get, maybe encourages them to see what else they can do there and opens up new strategies. Sometimes in the past, you all have kind of eye-rolled at this. You, person listening to this parlay, well, you're statistically very likely to be a person that understands their interest in making builds much more than most of the population. Video games are not made for people with that perspective at the moment, basically, ever. They don't assume that the audience has an intimate understanding of their personal taste and what they like about builds. So a lot of games that are very successful are successful partly because they help players find out that they would like a variety of different builds. And this can sometimes be a little irksome when it feels like the design is bending over backwards for it, for players that already like that. It feels like the game is sort of taking pains to help convince you that you will like the game you already know you will like, and you would like to just get down to making builds. But I think here it's a happy medium where there's kind of a build puzzle to be had by having the player need to invest a little in each character and kind of make the most of minimal investment or maximize a lot of investment. That would be a whole other topic, since you have a minimum deck size of 5, and it's obviously good to keep your deck small. Chrono Arc puts a lot of unique pressures on characters you invest in a lot as well, but of course that's a topic for another time, or we've kind of already talked about it in previous parlay here. It can be interesting to balance that mechanic. You encourage the player to try a character a little bit, and then maybe they get interested in them more, with, okay, yeah, but it's also interesting to make the most of investing minimally in, a given character or unit. I often say things like that and get not pushback, but people will say, but I don't like that element of making builds. I think that everybody could enjoy that given enough time or perspective. So I wonder if maybe these things are indeed a good idea, and it's just like bitter medicine for some people. They don't really want to think about this other thing at the surface, but when they get in there, they enjoy it. It reminds me of, players will moan and groan about a hard boss coming in your D&D campaign, but enjoy the fight. Like, it is fun for them for it to be hard, but they will not performatively. It's not like they're faking it. They won't say they're happy that it's going to be like way too hard, but they do. That is something they do like. Now, I personally don't relate to this. I tend to just say, well, right, that's good. I get that that's good. If a boss in a game that I'm finding easy is really hard, I don't think that's like mean because of course a hard boss is bad. That's just common sense. Like, no, in this context, it's common sense that it's good because I'm powerful, and what's fun is not to win, but to have a good fight. I will try to win. That's what makes it a good fight. I'm trying to win, but that it will be hard. When I send my players against an enemy that is too strong for them, they don't go, "Why are you challenging us?" Because that would be weird. The premise of the game is to challenge your builds. Well, you can play D&D in a way where you don't do that, but a very, very common reason you're playing is to have your builds and wits challenged. And so when I'm Eldritch blasting my characters from outside their vision range, from above, from someone who can clearly fly, and my level 1 players go, "We're dead. Like, you are killing us. Like, we are going to die." I just give them a coy look because I don't have to answer such questions as put by the animated spellbooks Zebashu. And I keep Eldritch blasting them, and they know, okay, he's saying figure it out. Hide behind something, man. I don't know what to tell you. I wouldn't do this if there was no way out of this situation for you. Or I don't know what their way out of the situation is. That actually sounds pretty messed up, but I don't know. You're in a forest. Figure it out. There's cover. One of them is an owl folk, so you can at least see them. I'm not sure that's a great idea because then they have line of sight on you, but they have options. Sure, you're in the middle of the woods. Figure it out, and they did, and it was a lot of fun. And likewise, I would hope that players getting a fourth character inherently understand that, I mean, this could be beneficial. I have more places to store items. That's a whole thing we didn't even talk about in this parlay. I think something that really helps is having it be that fourth character that maybe you aren't investing in as much can store stuff that you want room for anyway, or that you have already. You have to spend level up resources, something very limited that you'd like to save as much of as you can, to level up your fourth weird tank character. But you have items, probably, that simply don't fit on your other 3 characters. And so it is quite nice if you just have a good item anyway. You have a place to hold it now, your 4th character. They're not unwelcome, in other words. And then if a fight is challenging, the player might understand, oh, well, I don't want to just stall and tank through the fight, but the game has given me an option I wasn't interested in at first that is minimally leveled up already that, could help. And so I think it's a nice gameplay loop for players getting to grips with the system in Chrono Arc. That something hard comes along, they have something they weren't as interested in, their tank characters maybe been a little neglected, and then they can just immediately level them up and dynamically see, oh, now I have more tankiness skills. That could be nice to a point. And then they're making a real decision about how much to level that character, which I think is good, smart. That's like the game. So that's what that tangent about difficulty is meant to be about. I think that this formula of give the player, kind of force the player to have the option, sort of, but it's also kind of just good. And then put the player against challenges hard enough that they're looking for every advantage they can get. A player that would have said they were not that interested in squirreling away utility abilities may now have a very good experience of doing that. They might not be a player that would have done that normally, but if the game kind of leads them to that point, creates the environment for that, it can be really fun. And in many ways, build systems are only here to encourage the player to come up with cool little things like that. So very cool. This is a part of Chrono Arc's design I like very much, so I'm delighted that you made a parlay out of it. EyePatchNotes, this is a little different than some of yours have been formatted in the past, and I thought it was cool. It did end up being more directed by me, so I hope you enjoyed some of those directions. I purposefully went a little off the beaten path in some points in this discussion because you wrote a parlay that was a little more open-ended to what I had to say. So I hope that that was all right and still a lot of fun. I like this topic. I think it's interesting to see how games kind of, again, are making some amenities for players that maybe won't as open-endedly think of a ton of ideas for builds, but also just help the player manage that. Again, I believe this can be a win-win when done well. And I think one of the strongest things about Chrono Arc is that it's a game that I think will appeal to people that don't play these kinds of things that much, if they're willing to give it a chance. There's some initially unintuitive combat, but with a pretty good tutorial, in my opinion. That's rare. And then a pretty manageable build system that does help you get in there to more advanced tactics and like budgeting build resources. Sounds not that exciting, not a very sexy way to describe it, budgeting. But indeed, I think it is a sexy way to suggest it, that they give you, a little smattering of characters, 2 that you can pick, too semi-randomly, and then you've kind of got to level everyone a little bit so you give everybody a chance, and then you've got a space to hold extra items and utility abilities, and it's very interlocked. I think that's a very elegant decision. Indeed, if they get their passive at level 2, needing to level them to level 3 so you can level up your mana and stuff is not that much of a restriction. So hopefully most players wouldn't have been planning to keep a character at level 1 in the first place. Like, that's just not... though if they do essentially nothing at level 1, is it really worth? That's like a whole other thing. But in Chrono Arc, I do think like level 1 is kind of weird. Whatever. Thanks to the parlay. I thought this one was interesting. Again, I would love more about these weird balancing things. This was also related to an above average number of recent parlay, because you all have been on this topic about like strange balancing or game development issues like that, related things to that. So this was cool. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay like this one, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you with us. It can be about whatever you want, long or short, examples or none. I'm here to help. Looking forward to it. We'd love to have you. And I'll look forward to the next one.